Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Daisy, and if you're not new here, my name's still Daisy. But today, we're going to be talking about an extremely iconic movie. A movie that I know most of you would have watched because it's so famous and stars one of the most attractive men and women that's ever existed in the entire history of the whole entire planet. And that is, of course, Titanic, starring Kate Winslet as Rose and Leonardo DiCaprio as Jack. Now you might be wondering, Daisy, why are you talking about Titanic today? Isn't it over 25 years old? Yes, it is. But if you watched my last video about ancient Sparta, ancient Spartan society, the structure of ancient Sparta, I have found that I really enjoy making videos about history, and what better way to combine my two interests, movies and history, to make an historically accurate video. How historically accurate are these movies? Now, although I might not be a historian, I am definitely an enjoyer of history and movies. So today I thought it would be really fun to talk about what's accurate in the movie, who was real in real life, what things definitely wouldn't have happened in 1912 England. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, if you don't know what the movie is about, it is Romeo and Juliet, but on the setting of one of the biggest historical disasters that people are aware of, that has been documented, and that is, of course, the initial crash and sinking of the RMS Titanic on April 15th, 1912. Now, the Titanic was sailing from Southampton, England to New York, and on the ship it had crew members, and it had a first, second and third class. That will become important later. That's why I've mentioned it. Now first, before we get into the plot of the movie, the different societal class structures that I have a little bit of a problem with, let's talk about the main characters themselves. Now, a lot of people speculated that the main characters, Jack and Rose, were based on real people that really existed on the ship. But that's not actually accurate. They are fictional characters. Now, Jack himself definitely wasn't based on anyone. A lot of people thought he was based on a person that's gravestone is actually in the Titanic Memorial in Southampton, and that was someone called J. Dawson, because in the movie, Jack's last name is Dawson. But actually, that was a 17-year-old called Joseph Dawson, and he is not related. It has been stated that he is not related to the character in any way. Rose, on the other hand, even though she is fictional and there was no one by her name on the Titanic, she was loosely based around a survivor of the Titanic called Beatrice West. And Beatrice West lived for a long life, a fruitful life that a lot of people would associate Rose having after initially surviving the Titanic. Now, there will be spoilers about the plot of this movie in this video, obviously, because I have to take apart and break apart different plot points to talk about if they're historically accurate or not. So if you haven't seen the movie and you want to know the context to this video, then please go watch the movie prior to watching this. Okay, so Rose, based on loosely a real woman who survived the Titanic. And although James Cameron said he didn't base it around this character, he did take parts of her story to mold who Rose was as a character. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, Rose is a first-class passenger on the Titanic, and she meets and falls in love with a third-class passenger on the Titanic called Jack. Now, although these two characters aren't real, there are many characters featured in the movie that were definitely real people on the Titanic. The most famous one being Molly Brown, played by Kathy Bates in the movie, and her real name was Margaret Brown. Her nickname was Molly, and she was also given the nickname the Unsinkable Molly Brown because she was one of the people on the lifeboats that forced the crew members to go back and pick bodies out of the ocean that were still alive. A lot of the crew were very eager to just take who they initially had, mainly first-class passengers, women and children, and first-class men, you know, away from the ship for survival. But Molly Brown famously told them to go back and pick up any any people they could see that was visibly alive in the water, which I think is sick. Without her, I think a few more people would have lost their lives that day. And regardless of class, she knew that she had to help those people. Slay Molly Brown. The next person who was very, very much a real person was the captain of the ship, Captain Smith, and he was at the time a very, very famous boat captain. And it's not like he was unfamiliar with the waters or even the journey itself. He was very famously known for wanting to go fast, but at the time, this was not a contributing factor to the crash at all. It was just an unfortunate event that couldn't be stopped when they realized how severe it was, when they realized that they'd gotten the type of iceberg wrong, when they realized that they had gotten the steering wrong initially. There was nothing he could do, and he was very famous and capable, which is why this accident was so tragic, because it couldn't be avoided at the time. Does that make sense? But Captain Smith was very much a famous person. I don't know how accurate the depiction of him was. I've watched a lot of other historians talk about him and his personality, and it seems like it was pretty accurate. I mean, some parts wouldn't be like him. Apparently he was very, very skilled, knew exactly what he was doing. And so it's strange that some parts of his character was shown as being quite naive or not knowledgeable on what to do. He definitely knew what to do, but it was just an unforeseen circumstance as to why the ship crashed. So yes, he was very much a real person that was on the Titanic when it sunk. And the last character I want to talk about today is J. Bruce Ismay, played by Jonathan Hyde, and he was the managing director and chairman of White Star Line, the shipping company that profited from the construction of the Titanic. And why he is famous, not because he was on the ship, not because he survived the sinking, but he famously took the place of women and children on the lifeboats and was very, 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 very heavily criticized by the media after the fact. He gave speeches in the Senate about the events that happened on April 15th, 1912, and he was very heavily criticized, harshly criticized by the media for his actions of prioritizing himself over other passengers, namely women and children. At the time, women and children were definitely prioritized on getting on the lifeboats, and he allegedly took a seat from that, so the media were not his biggest fans. And why I mention it is because it's the opposite to Molly Brown and the coverage she got after the sinking, where she was very much deemed as a hero because of her actions going back trying to save as many people as possible. So those are just some real life people that were depicted by actors that I wanted to mention. There were so many more, but their stories, although important, and a lot of them were survivors because they were in first class, their stories were not as relevant to the aftermath of the sinking, or their depictions of their characters were not as vital to the actual movie itself. So I just thought I'd mention a few of those people just in case you wanted some fun facts about who was real and not real. You can definitely look up other characters that were based on real people if you want to know more about that, but those are the ones I just wanted to mention. Now getting into the big question. How accurate would it have been for Rose and Jack to not only meet, but fall in love, and for their story to play out how it did on the Titanic? Now, I really don't want to burst anyone's bubble here. I will explain why I'm giving this answer, and I know it's fiction, and I know it's meant to be an extreme version of what could happen, and I know it's a fantasy, but if you're here for historical accuracy, I'm going to give you a historical accuracy answer. And my answer is, I don't know if Jack and Rose would have ever met, ever crossed paths. And the fact they did, where they did, how they did, let me explain it to you. We talk a lot in society about class systems now. I'm from the UK, so I can only talk about that perspective. Um, we talk a lot about class systems. We talk a lot about class divide, classism. But imagining classism in 2025 versus class divide in 1912, it's night and day. It's not only is it segregation, it's avid avoidance of the lower class. Now, on the Titanic, they had first class, it was luxury, it was rich people. They even mention old and new money in the movie, which is a very real concept at that time. Old money was generational wealth, you inherited it from your family, your name took you a lot of places rather than what you owned. Your name was so important. And then there was new money, people who had discovered it through oil, or people who had found their wealth in foreign countries and trade, and people who may not have come from wealthy families. I mean, I'm not saying that a lot of new money came from poverty. A lot of them did come from families of influence, but they were not considered upper class by any means at that time. New money would refer to the people that found their fortune through business, trade, and going into industries. That's a lot of what Molly Brown's character was depicted as. Molly Brown was famously married to someone of new money, and in the movie she was depicted as someone that didn't really fit in, because even within the first class there was divide between the old generational wealth and the new money. They felt like they weren't worthy to be a part of their circle. So if Molly Brown had people looking at her, making comments about her, being reluctant to sit with her at dinner, what makes you think that Jack Dawson was allowed into that dining room? The one scene that really depicts the historical inaccuracy for me is when he gets invited to dinner by Rose, and for saving her life when she accidentally tripped. Now, talking about that, I don't know how accurately Rose would have been allowed on the third class deck. There were guards, there were gates, there were doors. They weren't allowed to mingle with each other. It's not like just the third class were not allowed to go to second class, or even, God forbid, first class. But in the same way, the first class wouldn't even imagine going down to the third class deck. I mean, I don't know how accurate it is, but in the movie they talk about how the first class people have the crew take their dogs down to the third class deck so they can go to the bathroom. That is such an all-encompassing idea of how first class not only viewed third class, but how foreign their interactions were and how far away their worlds were. So for Rose to be able to go to the third class deck anyway, not so accurate. But for her to even meet Jack, to entertain Jack being a lady of first class, of course it's a very nice scene where he saves her and things like that, but it's just not. She might have been someone going against the grain, going against her parents' expectations, going against societal norms, but she still would have had so much social pressure, and that interaction it wouldn't have happened to a normal person realistically. But of course, it's a love story, so let's pretend it did happen. Even if they did have that interaction on the decking, him being invited to dinner, him being invited to sit at the table of some of the most influential people of the time, not only the time, but of creating the Titanic itself, I don't think he would have been allowed. Maybe he would have been given a little bit of money. Maybe he would have been given a cigar. Maybe he would have been given a pat on the back for saving her life. He would not have been allowed to interact in their world, interact in the dining hall, not only by the guest inviting him, but the crew would have been told to not allow him in that room. So that scene for me is one of the most historically inaccurate, because maybe they met. Maybe they fell in love. Okay, maybe. But him interacting in her world like that would not have happened. Maybe she would have gone down to the third deck. Okay, I'll give you some cadence in that. But he wouldn't have been allowed in those spaces, and that's just the God's honest truth, because at that time social class and social divide was so strong, he wouldn't even have thought about being allowed in there. He would have just accepted that he wouldn't be allowed. Now, not only would he not be allowed, her mother, her husband, would never have allowed her to interact with someone of his social standing. And that's just the God's honest truth. They wouldn't have met. They wouldn't have interacted. They might have seen each other over the railing in the distance, but she wouldn't be hanging out on the third deck. She wouldn't be hanging out there. And what really gets me is that there were so many instances where they were in public, in each other's areas, where other people saw, and no one questioned it. No one told him to leave. They would have told him to leave. They would have told her to leave. She should have known her place at that time. Anyway, so that's not very historically accurate, but I digress. Now, talking more about the scenes they have together, where are they? When they sneak downstairs into the basement and have the car scene, we all know what I'm talking about. Why is Kate Winslet's costume immaculately white? She's running through the basement, the storage rooms of a gigantic steamship. She would have been covered in smoke and soot. Her whole face would have been blackened by the soot. Why is she in pristine white clothing when they go into that car? That part always really interests me. I know it's for the story, but this is what you're here for. You're here for historically accurate things. I just don't know how historically accurate that is. She would have been covered in soot. Covered in it. She would not have looked that good. Now, moving on to the ending, to the sinking of the actual ship. These are just some highlighted parts I want to talk about. Now, actually, the actual sinking of the ship, very historically accurate. From the accounts we have, the breaking in half, the one part sinking before the other one, and the other one bobbing in the air, in the water for a long time. That's actually pretty much exactly how it happened. And from the accounts we have, very, very accurate. Very, very accurate. Rose on the door, floating in the water, Jack holding on for dear life. Now listen. They were in the Arctic, the top of the Atlantic Ocean, right? Firstly, Jack wouldn't have survived that long in that water. He would have gotten hypothermia pretty instantly. Secondly, could he fit on the door? I don't know. I honestly don't know. This is a historically accurate video, not a scientifically accurate video. If anyone can give me in the comments, would he have fit? Would he not have fit? I would love that. But apart from that, would that have happened? Probably not. You know, they weren't real people. It didn't really happen, but it's really great for the movie, and I love that scene, and it's so sad when she lets go of him. So yes, guys, those are some points about how historically accurate the Titanic is. I'm sorry to disappoint with my answer. I know people are going to say, it's a movie. Who cares if it's historically accurate? But that's what this video is about. If you wanted to know curiously, would they have met in a real situation? Would they have interacted? Would he have been allowed in the first class setting? My answer would be probably not. I'm sorry. But it's great that they fell in love and they met. I'm so happy for them. But they weren't real people. And it didn't really happen. But it's a great movie. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.